air changed the moment Dr. Ben Carter turned off the interstate. 1 minute, he was on the clean, sterile asphalt of the modern world, the air conditioning of his sedan fighting a losing battle against the generic Florida sun. The next, he was on the Cypress Road, and the world outside his window became a living, breathing entity. The pavement cracked and surrendered to patches of gravel and sand. Ancient cypress trees, draped in shrouds of Spanish moss, leaned over the road, their branches interlocking to form a suffocating green tunnel. The sunlight, once bright and harsh, became dappled and murky, as if filtered through stagnant water. 10 years, a decade of meticulously constructed denial, mantled by a single turn of the wheel. Ben gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He was a man of science, a biologist who understood the intricate dance of predator and prey, of life and decay. He could name every species of fern clinging to the bark of those trees, could explain the symbiotic relationship between the algae and fungi that formed the lichen. Logic was his shield, his scalpel, the tool he used to dissect the world into manageable, understandable pieces. But here, logic felt thin, a flimsy barrier against the oppressive weight of memory. The air, thick and wet, smelled of rich soil, of rot, and of something else, something metallic and primal that clung to the back of his throat. It was the smell of the bayou, the smell of home, the smell of the day Lily was lost. He hadn't wanted to come back. When the lawyer called about his mother's passing, his first instinct was to handle it all remotely. Sell the house, liquidate the assets, sever the final tie. But there were papers to sign, a house full of a life he'd long since abandoned. It had to be done. It was, he told himself, a practical matter, an equation to be solved. But the swamp didn't care for equations. As he drove deeper, the cicadas began their chorus, a high, incessant thrum that vibrated in his teeth. It wasn't just a sound, it was the frequency of his guilt. THRUM-THRUM-THRUM-. He remembered that sound. It was the soundtrack to a perfect, sun-drenched afternoon. He was 17, absorbed in a textbook, while Lily, the whirlwind of a 7-year-old, chased dragonflies by the water's edge. THRUM-THRUM-THRUM. The image flashed behind his eyes, sharp and unwelcome. A small hand, pale and delicate. Fingers splayed as it slipped beneath the black, reflective surface of the water. There was no scream, no splash he could recall. Just the oppressive thrum of the cicadas and a sudden, terrible silence where his sister's laughter used to be. Ben flinched, his foot jerking on the accelerator. The car swerved, tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. He corrected, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was Dr. Carter, a respected academic. He did not have flashbacks. He had intrusive memories, products of unresolved trauma, a textbook case. He could analyze it. He could control it. He rolled down the window, hoping a blast of fresh air would clear his head. It was a mistake. The humidity washed over him, a physical presence that felt like a damp hand on his face. He was breathing the past. Finally, the trees thinned, and the town of St. Leroux revealed itself, not with a welcome, but with a sigh of decay. Porches sagged, paint peeled from clapboard houses like sunburned skin. The few people on the streets moved with a lethargy that seemed born of the heat and something deeper, a collective weariness. The town was a fossil, a perfect specimen of arrested development. And at the end of the main street, waiting for him, was his mother's house, stood exactly as he remembered, a 2-story box of memories he was now expected to pack away. This, he thought, was the real reason he'd come back, not to sell a house, but to perform an exorcism on himself. It was a museum of grief. Dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon light, illuminating the stale air. Ben worked with a detached efficiency, sorting his mother's life into cardboard boxes and black trash bags. It was easier that way. He treated her belongings as artifacts. He didn't have to acknowledge the woman who had worn the faded floral dresses or the hands that had held the well-worn prayer books. He was clearing out her bedside Tabala wasteland of pill bottles and yellowing tissues when his fingers brushed against a small, folded piece of paper tucked beneath a rosary. He opened it. The handwriting was his mother's, but it was jagged, frantic, nothing like her elegant script. It was the writing of a terrified mind. They won't let her rest. The Gators know. Ben read the words twice. A cold knot tightened in his stomach, an involuntary reaction he immediately tried to suppress. It was nonsense. The tragic ramblings of a woman whose mind had been eroded by grief and medication. For decades, she had prayed for Lily's body to be found for a proper burial. When it never was, her faith must have curdled, latching onto the dark folklore that festered in the town's humid air. The Gators, of course, in St. Leroux. Every unexplained disappearance, every shadow on the water was eventually blamed on the Gators. He folded the note, intending to throw it away, but hesitated. Instead, he slipped it into his pocket, a specimen of his mother's delusion. Nothing more. The note, however, was a splinter in his mind. It pushed him out of the suffocating house and into the street, his feet carrying him toward the one place he had sworn he would not go to. St. Augustine's Rest was less a cemetery and more a crumbling city of the dead. Because the ground was too wet to dig, the deceased were interred in above-ground tombs, crowded together in crooked rows. They were stained green with algae and black with age, their stone angels weeping grimy tears. The cemetery was bordered, on one side by a low, crumbling brick wall, and on the other by the bayou itself. The black, still water lapped quietly at the edge of the consecrated ground. A constant, silent encroachment. What struck Ben first was the silence. The incessant thrum of the cicadas, the drone of the swamp. It all stopped at the cemetery gates. The quiet here was not peaceful. It was a vacuum, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound. It felt unnatural, like a held breath. He found the Carter plot easily, and there, next to the grand tombs of his ancestors, was a simple marble slab set in the ground. Cenotaph for a body the bayou had never returned. Lily Carter, beloved daughter, forever in our hearts. The words were hollow, a polite fiction for a loss that had no resolution. As Ben stood there, the feeling that had started on the Cypress Road returned with a suffocating intensity. He felt watched. He scanned the cemetery. It was empty. No groundskeeper, no other mourners. Yet the sensation persisted, prickling the skin on his neck. It wasn't a human gaze. It was the collective, indifferent stare of the landscape. The ancient, moss-draped oaks felt like silent witnesses. The murky water of the bayou felt like a single, unblinking eye. He was a scientist, standing on a plot of land, looking at a piece of carved rock. That was all. But as he looked from the cold, empty promise of the memorial stone to the dark, waiting water just feet away, a shiver of primal fear traced its way down his spine. The logic was the wall, and the swamp was the water, and for the first time in a decade, he could feel the cracks forming. A dry, scraping sound broke the unnatural silence. Ben turned from Lily's memorial to see a man who looked as ancient as the tombs themselves. He was wiry and sunbaked, his skin the texture of cracked leather, and he leaned on a shovel as if it were the only thing holding him upright. Ben Carter, the man rasped. It wasn't a question. Heard you was back, burying your mother, Silas. Ben acknowledged, the name dredged up from his childhood. Silas had been the caretaker here for as long as Ben could remember, a permanent fixture of St. Augustine's Rest. You're a science man now, ain't you? Silas said, his eyes, pale and watery, fixing on Ben, a doctor of something or other. Gestured with his chin toward a different section of the cemetery. Come look at this. Tell me what your science makes of it. Silas led him away from the familiar decay of the old tombs to a mausoleum that gleamed with the vulgarity of new money. It was stark white marble, a recent and unwelcome addition to the crumbling landscape. The name Devereaux was carved above the heavy door in a severe, modern font. Came down from up north a few years back, Silas muttered, as if that explained everything. Paid cash for the old mill property. He stopped before the mausoleum's face, and Ben saw what he was meant to see. 3 deep, parallel gouges were carved into the polished marble. They weren't the jagged lines of a vandal's tool. They were deliberate, powerful arcs, starting high and sweeping downwards. They looked for all the world like claw marks, massive ones. Ben's scientific mind clicked into gear, a defense mechanism against the cold dread seeping into his bones. He stepped closer, his reflection a distorted ghost on the marble surface. The marks were at least 5 feet off the ground. Ran his fingers along one of the grooves. The edges were sharp, chipping the stone. An alligator, he said, the word tasting absurd on his tongue. It's possible, if it was a big one. Rearing up gators don't climb tombs. Silas cut in, his voice flat. A K, and they don't leave marks that high, not unless they're standing on 2 feet. Ben's mind raced through other possibilities. A black bear driven south, highly improbable. A tool, then, a custom-made rake or a pickaxe wielded with incredible force. The precision, the biomechanical look of the arcs argued against it. Every logical explanation he formulated felt thin, a desperate attempt to patch a hole in his understanding of the world. Happened last night, Silas said, looking not at the tomb, but toward the bayou. The water was black and motionless. Full moon. They get restless on a full moon. Ben asked, turning from the scratches. Silas spat a stream of dark tobacco juice that hissed as it hit the damp earth. This place, ... it has guardians, always has. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the thick air. And the dead, ... they owe a toll to the water. Some debts get paid, one way or another. He offered no further explanation. With a final, weary look at the desecrated tomb, Silas shouldered his shovel and shuffled away, his form disappearing among the crooked monuments, leaving Ben alone. Ben stood, frozen, the caretaker's words echoing in the profound silence. He looked from the impossible scratches on the marble to the dark, waiting water of the bayou, and then he thought of the frantic note in his pocket. They won't let her rest. The Gators know. The world had just presented him with a piece of data that didn't fit any known model. And for the first time, Ben Carter felt the cold, terrifying suspicion that his science might not be enough to explain what was happening in St. Leroux. Sleep offered no escape. It dragged him down into the black, murky water of his own subconscious. He was 17 again, but the sun was gone, replaced by a sickly, perpetual twilight. He saw Lily by the water's edge, not laughing, but standing perfectly still, her back to him. He called her name, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive humidity. When she turned, her eyes were wide and empty. From the bayou, a shadow detached itself from the other shadows. It was long and low, a reptilian silhouette that moved with an unnatural fluidity. It wasn't just an alligator, it was a void in the shape of one. It slid from the water without a sound, its claws leaving deep furrows in the mud, and coiled around Lily's ankles. She didn't scream. She simply looked at Ben, a silent question in her empty eyes as the shadow pulled her backward into the black water. Ben awoke with a gasp, his sheets twisted around him, his body slick with sweat. The nightmare was a textbook manifestation of his guilt. His mind weaving the day's anxieties, the note, the scratches, Silas's words into the fabric of his trauma. He repeated this to himself like a mantra as he showered, as he forced down a cup of bitter coffee. It was psychology. It was explainable, but the feeling of the dream, the cold, slithering dread clung to him. To fight it, he needed data. He needed to drag this local superstition into the harsh light of academic rigor. He drove to the St. Leroux Parish Library, a small brick building that smelled of dust and mildew. In the back, under a flickering fluorescent light, was a local history section. It was 2 shelves of crumbling, leather-bound books and yellowed, self-published pamphlets. He found it in a thin volume titled Bayou Whispers and Moss-Covered Truths, written by a woman named Elodie Devereaux. The name gave him a jolt. Flipped through the brittle pages, his eyes scanning for any mention of the cemetery. And then he saw it. The legend of the graveyard gators wasn't just a boogeyman story. It was a detailed mythology. They weren't creatures of flesh and blood, but psychopomps, a term from Greek myth that made the biologist in him shudder. They were spiritual guardians, extensions of the bayou's will. When a soul with a heavy debt was laid to rest in St. Augustine's, the gators would come. They were judges and debt collectors, dragging the unsettled spirits from their tombs and back into the water to pay what was owed. The book described them as being made of shadow and moss, with eyes that burned like swamp gas. It was fascinating. It was absurd. Ben took meticulous notes, his pen scratching across his notepad, dissecting the folklore as if it were a specimen. But as he read, the world outside the library window began to shift. The gnarled branches of an oak tree seemed to twist into a reptilian snout. The pattern of cracks on the sidewalk resembled scales. He shook his head, trying to clear the images. It was pareidolia, his brain creating patterns where none existed. Another textbook psychological phenomenon. He drove back to his mother's house as dusk began to fall, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. He felt a growing paranoia, a sense that he was being watched. Every log floating in the ditches alongside the road looked like a submerged predator. Every rustle in the undergrowth sounded like something heavy being dragged through the leaves. That night, barricaded himself in the house, but he knew it was useless. The fear wasn't outside. It was in his head, rewriting his memories, poisoning his grief. The dream came again, more vivid this time. He saw the shadow gator pull Lily into the water, and he saw her small hand break the surface one last time. But this time, it wasn't reaching for him. It was waving goodbye. The name from the book, Elodie Devereaux, was an itch he couldn't scratch. The folklore was one thing, but the connection to the desecrated tomb was a variable his scientific mind couldn't dismiss. He needed more than whispers and legends. He needed primary sources. The library had been a dead end. But there was one other place, the St. Leroux Historical Society. It was housed in the old courthouse, a once grand building now surrendering to gravity and humidity. As Ben walked through the town square to get there, he felt the town's sickness more acutely than ever. People sat on benches, not talking, just staring with a profound listlessness into the oppressive heat. A woman watering her drooping flowers moved with the slow, jerky motions of an automaton. Their eyes were dull, their faces slack with a quiet despair. It was like watching a film slowly grind to a halt. Ben felt a strange resonance with their apathy, familiar hollowness echoing in his own chest. The Historical Society was a single, cavernous room run by a woman who looked like she'd been cataloged and left on a shelf herself. She pointed him toward a series of water-stained ledgers and dusty boxes without looking up from her knitting. "Everything we have is in there," she mumbled. "Don't expect much." He started with the town charter, dated 1848. It was a story of hope and hardship, of families carving a life out of the unforgiving swamp. Then he found the parish records from 1853. That's when the wasting sickness began. The descriptions were horrifying. It wasn't a clean, clinical plague. It was a fever that brought with it madness, hallucinations, and a deep, inconsolable grief. It rotted the mind before it took the body. Then, in a ledger from 1854, the entries abruptly changed. The sickness, which had been raging for a year, simply stopped. The page was dominated by a single, cryptic entry. The ink faded to a rusty brown dot. The pact is struck. The bayou is appeased. One soul for the health of the whole. The founding families, Carter, Levesque, Thibodeau, and Devereaux shall honor. The told Ben felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's damp air. He cross-referenced the names with the death records. Young woman, Isabel Devereaux, had drowned in the bayou the same week the entry was made. There was no mention of the wasting sickness ever again. He dug deeper, his hands covered in the dust of forgotten lives. He found journals, family letters, a hidden history beneath the official one. The pact was real. Every generation, one of the 4 founding families was to give a volunteer to the bayou. It wasn't a murder, it was a ritual, a willing sacrifice to keep the sickness at bay. For over a century, they had honored it. The town prospered, the secret kept by a conspiracy of silence, until the generation before Lily's birth. The last recorded offering was in 1952. The next was due in the late 1970s from the Thibodeau family. But according to the records, the last of the Thibodeaus had packed up and left town in 1975, breaking the chain. The debt had gone unpaid, and now the sickness was returning. Not as a fever, but as the slow, creeping madness he saw in the eyes of the townspeople. It was a psychological plague, a curse of apathy and despair. The town wasn't just dying, it was being unmade from the inside out. The graveyard gators weren't just folklore, they were the enforcers of a contract, coming to collect on a debt that was decades overdue. The scratches on the Devereaux tomb were not a random act of vandalism. They were an invoice. The knowledge of the pact changed everything. It was a lens that brought the town's decay into sharp, horrifying focus. Ben drove away from the courthouse, his mind racing, trying to fit the pieces together. The unpaid debt, the returning sickness, the scratches on the Devereaux tomb. It was a sequence, a cause and effect as logical as any biological process. But one detail still gnawed at him. The Devereaux family had provided the first sacrifice, but their turn wasn't due again for generations. Why was their new tomb the one that was marked? He needed a name. Back in his mother's house, he found a stack of recent local newspapers. He flipped through the obituaries, the ink staining his fingertips. And there it was. Antoine Devereaux, beloved husband and father, passed away peacefully 2 weeks ago. The date of death was listed. Ben pulled out his phone and did a quick search of the parish's public records online. He found the official certificate, and that's when he saw it. It's a small, impossible detail. The date of interment was listed as the day before the certified date of death. A clerical error. It had to be a simple, human mistake. But in the suffocating paranoia of St. Leroux, it felt like a crack in reality, a rushed burial, a fraudulent offering. The town elders, desperate to appease the bayou after decades of neglect, must have seen the return of a Devereaux as a sign. They must have tried to offer up Antoine, hoping the name was enough to satisfy the debt. The scratches weren't a random attack, they were a message. This is not the one we are owed. The thought was so monstrous, so cold-blooded, that it propelled him into action. This was no longer about folklore. A tease was about a human conspiracy. Night fell thick and starless. Ben waited until the town was asleep, then drove to the edge of the cemetery. Parking his car in the deep shadows of the cypress trees, he grabbed a tire iron from his trunk, the cold steel feeling heavy and alien in his hand. He was a scientist about to commit breaking and entering. The absurdity of it was almost laughable. The cemetery's silence was even more profound at night. The air was still, and the only sound was the frantic pounding of his own heart. He found the Devereaux Mausoleum, its white marble glowing faintly in the moonlight, the claw marks looking like fresh wounds. The heavy bronze door was locked tight. He wedged the tip of the tire iron into the seam, leveraging his weight against it. The metal groaned in protest. He pushed harder, sweat stinging his eyes, his muscles screaming. With a sharp crack, lock gave way, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the dead quiet. He froze, listening. Nothing. Only the whisper of the wind through the Spanish moss. He pushed the heavy door open. The air that rolled out was cold and sterile, smelling of stone, dust, and nothing else. Not of decay, not of flowers, not of death. He flicked on his phone's flashlight, the beam cutting a nervous path through the darkness. The inside was a small, empty chamber. There was a single stone slab, a shelf meant to hold a coffin. It was bare. He ran his hand over the surface. It was smooth, cool, and coated in a fine layer of dust. No scuff marks, no indentations. Nothing had ever rested here. Antoine Devereaux was not in his tomb. He had never been in his tomb. The terror that gripped Ben was a new and terrifying species. It wasn't the primal fear of a supernatural monster. It was the cold, sharp fear of human evil. Silas, his mother, the whole town, they weren't just victims of a curse. They were players in a desperate, deadly game. And they had just tried to cheat. As he stood there in the empty crypt, he felt the cemetery's silence press in on him. And he knew with a chilling certainty that the real monsters weren't the ones that lived in the water. They were the ones who lived on the land. Ben drove with a cold, clear purpose that felt nothing like his earlier paranoia. The tire iron was on the passenger seat next to him, a stark reminder of the line he had crossed. He wasn't a scientist anymore. He was a man with a question, and he knew the only person who might have the answer. He found Silas's shack tucked away behind the cemetery, half swallowed by the encroaching swamp. A single yellow bulb burned over the door, attracting a frantic cloud of moths. Ben didn't knock. He slammed the door open with the flat of his hand, the wood shuddering in its frame. Silas was sitting at a small table, a bottle of cheap whiskey and a dirty glass in front of him. He looked up, his eyes wide with fear, not surprise. He had been expecting him. "The Devereaux tomb is empty," Ben said, his voice low and hard. He let the words hang in the thick, humid air. Silas flinched, his hand trembling as he reached for the bottle. "Don't know nothing about that. Don't lie to me," Ben snapped, stepping into the small room. It smelled of whiskey and old fear. "I know about the pact. I know about the Thibodeaux leaving. I know the town tried to cheat the bayou with an empty grave." The old caretaker deflated, the false bravado draining out of him like air from a punctured lung. He looked down at his gnarled hands. "We were scared," he whispered. "The sickness. It was coming back. The listlessness. The bad dreams. Folks getting strange. Your mother, she felt it more than anyone, said the roots of this town were rotten." Ben's blood ran cold. "My mother, she was a Carter," Silas said, finally looking up, his eyes pleading. "One of the founding bloodlines. She knew what had to be done. We all did. The elders. We saw that Devereaux fella come back to town, and we thought maybe it was a sign, a chance to set things right." He shook his head, but the bayou knew. It always knows. A decade of carefully managed guilt, of self-recrimination, of a grief so profound it had shaped his entire adult life, was beginning to fracture. "What does this have to do with my sister?" Ben demanded. his voice cracking. Silas closed his eyes, and a single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. The debt was never paid. The Thibodeaux ran. The bayou was getting angry. We could all feel it. Then there was Lily. The world tilted. The air in the small shack became thin, unbreathable. She was always drawn to the water. That one, Silas continued, his voice barely a whisper. Oh, real swamp child. Not like you, with your books. She was a Carter. She had the old blood. She could feel it call into her. The scene played out in Ben's mind, but this time it was different. He wasn't the negligent brother, lost in a book. He was seeing it through their eyes. We knew, Silas choked out, the words tasting like poison. We knew the bayou wanted its due. We saw her that day, by the water's edge. Your mother, ... She saw her, and we did nothing. The confession landed with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from Ben's lungs. It wasn't a conspiracy to murder. It was something infinitely more cruel. A conspiracy of inaction. You let her die, Ben said, the words hollow. You stood by and you let a 7-year-old girl drown to pay your debts. We hoped it would be enough. Silas cried, his voice breaking into a sob. Just to quiet it down. A down payment. We told ourselves it was God's will that the bayou had chosen, then stumbled back, hitting the doorframe. The guilt that had been his constant companion for 10 years evaporated, replaced by something white-hot and volcanic. It was rage. A pure, clean rage that burned away the grief and left only the ashes of betrayal. His entire life, his entire identity as the brother who had failed, was a lie. A convenient story they had allowed him to believe, narrative that covered their own monstrous sin. He pulled his mother's frantic note from his pocket and threw it on the table. They won't let her rest. The Gators know. The day, Ben said, his voice shaking with the force of his realization. It wasn't just the Gators, was it? It was you. It was my mother. You wouldn't let her rest. You used her. Silas stared at the note, his body racked with tremors. Your mother. She was never the same after. The guilt, ... It ate her alive. Just like the sickness is eating this town. Ben looked at the pathetic, weeping old man and felt nothing. Pity, no compassion. He turned and walked out of the shack, leaving Silas to drown in his whiskey and his guilt. He walked past the cemetery, past the empty tombs and the false memorials, his feet carrying him toward the dark, waiting water. The monsters were real, but they weren't in the bayou. He had grown up with them. He had called one of them Mother. The rage that had propelled Ben from Silas's shack did not cool. It settled deep in his bones, a cold, hard weight where his guilt used to be. He walked through St. Leroux as if in a dream, but for the first time, he felt awake. The town's sickness was no longer a subtle wrongness. It was a screaming wound. He saw the woman who watered her flowers, now clawing at the dead petals, whispering to them. He saw the store owner staring at his own reflection in the dusty storefront window, his lips moving in a silent, frantic argument. The bayou had been cheated, and its rage was a poison seeping into the minds of everyone in town. Ben felt it too, but differently. The entity wasn't trying to drive him mad, it was trying to communicate. He found himself at the edge of his mother's property, standing before the dilapidated wooden dock where his life had fractured. The water was unnaturally still, a sheet of black glass reflecting the bruised twilight sky. And, standing at the end of the dock, was Lily. It wasn't the empty-eyed phantom from his nightmares. This was Lily as he remembered her, 7 years old, in her favorite yellow sundress, her hair in pigtails. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking down into the water, her expression one of serene curiosity. Lily, Ben whispered, the name. a shard of glass in his throat. She turned, and her smile was real. It was the same gap-toothed, innocent smile that had haunted his memory for a decade. "It's quiet now, Benny," she said, her voice a perfect echo from the past. "It's not angry anymore." Ben's scientific mind screamed at him. Hallucination, auditory and visual manifestation of extreme psychological distress. But his heart, shattered and remade by rage, saw only his sister. "You're not real," he said, the words lacking conviction. "They didn't understand," she said, ignoring him. She took a step closer, her bare feet making no sound on the weathered wood. "They thought it wanted to hurt me, but it was just ... lonely. It needed a friend." A new kind of grief, sharp and confusing, pierced through Ben's anger. Was this the monster wearing his sister's face, weaving a sophisticated lie? Or was this the truth, a truth more terrible than he could possibly imagine? That Lily hadn't been a victim, but a participant. "The water is waiting," she said, her voice losing its childish lilt. "It's taking on a deeper, resonant quality, like stones rubbing together at the bottom of a river. The debt is old. The toll must be paid." Try to cheat with an empty grave. They tried to cheat with me, but the bloodline is what matters. A Carter must pay the toll. She held out her small hand, the same hand he saw in his nightmares, the one that had slipped beneath the surface. But this time, it wasn't a memory of loss. It was an invitation. "Come on, Benny," she urged, her form beginning to shimmer, to lose its solid shape, her edges blurring into the deepening twilight. "It's your turn. Restore the balance. Join me." The lure was almost irresistible. To shed the pain, the betrayal, the rage. To atone not for his failure, but for his family's sin. To find a final, twisted peace with his sister in the quiet, dark water. For a moment, he saw the appeal. He saw the end of his pain. He took a step onto the dock. The wood groaned under his weight. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of ozone and wet earth. The whispers started then, not just Lily's voice, but a chorus rising from the water, from the trees, from the very ground beneath him. The voices of the other offerings, the souls bound to the bayou for eternity. "Join us, pay the toll, be at peace." Ben looked at the shimmering apparition of his sister, the hand offered to him, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he wasn't investigating a mystery. Kay was the mystery. Kay, he was no longer a scientist observing a phenomenon. He was the final variable in a century-old equation. The bayou was calling him to solve it. Ben didn't take the shimmering hand. He looked past the illusion of his sister, his gaze fixed on the black, waiting water. The whispers promised peace, but he knew it was the peace of surrender, of oblivion. The rage in his heart had cooled, replaced by a scientist's cold curiosity and a brother's desperate need for the real truth. He would not be lured. He would go willingly. He turned from the dock and went to the old shed, retrieving the key to his father's flat-bottomed skiff. He untied the boat, the rope stiff and coarse in his hands. He didn't start the outboard motor. He took the oars and with a quiet splash pushed off into the bayou. The journey was a descent into a world outside of time, where the narrow channels of the swamp were a labyrinth. But the boat seemed to know the way. Current, where there should have been none, pulled him deeper. The air grew still, the sounds of the dying town fading behind him, replaced by a profound, listening silence. Luminescent fungi cast an eerie blue-green glow on the cypress knees that rose from the water like skeletal hands. He was being led to the heart of it all. The channel opened into a perfectly circular lagoon he had never seen before. In the center stood a single colossal cypress tree, impossibly ancient, its base wider than his mother's house, its branches heavy with moss, blotted out the sky, creating a cathedral of shadow and twilight. The water here was perfectly clear, in the bottom was a mosaic of smooth, white stones. This was the sanctum. As the skiff drifted to a stop, the water around him began to move, not with a ripple, but with a slow, powerful displacement. From the depths rose the guardians. They were not the shadow gators of his nightmares, but creatures of mud and moss and memory. Their forms were ancient, their hides looking like cracked earth, their eyes holding the cold, unblinking wisdom of millennia. They were the bayou's antibodies, its immune system. And Ben was the infection they had come to treat. They formed a circle around his boat. Their presence, not threatening, but absolute. Then, the water before him began to churn, and a consciousness flooded his mind. It wasn't a voice. It was a torrent of images, feelings, and pure, unfiltered knowledge. He saw the bayou not as a swamp, but as a single, living organism, ancient and aware. He felt its slow, deep thoughts, the rhythm of its existence measured in centuries. He felt its confusion and pain when the wasting sicknesses sucked poison from the earth. A human mistake leached into its waters. He felt its surprise when the first humans, desperate and dying, offered a life in exchange for a cure, creating a symbiotic bond, a pact born of fear and necessity. Then he saw Lily. The vision was not a memory. It was a truth. He saw her, a small girl with the old blood of the Carters, walking to the water's edge. He saw his mother and Silas and the others watching from a distance, paralyzed by fear and hope. But Lily wasn't afraid. She looked into the water, and she understood. She could feel the bayou's pain, its loneliness, its confusion at the broken promise. She wasn't taken. She wasn't sacrificed by the elders. She saw the debt, and with the simple, profound clarity of a child, she chose to pay it. She walked into the water as if returning home, small life a balm on the ancient entity's wound. The vision faded, leaving Ben gasping, the truth a weight far heavier than his guilt had ever been. Lily had not been a victim. She had been a savior. The consciousness focused on him again, and he understood what it wanted. Lily's sacrifice had been a temporary fix, a down payment made with the pure currency of innocence. But it hadn't sealed the pact. The entity didn't want another death, wanted a permanent solution. It wanted a bridge. It wanted him, not his body, but his mind. A Carter, one of the original bloodlines, but one who was also a man of science, of logic, of the modern world. It needed a conscious, willing anchor, a mind that could understand both the ancient magic of the pact and the modern world that threatened it, to join with it, to become its caretaker, its interpreter, its guardian, merge with the alligator god. The choice was laid bare before him, clear and terrible. He could refuse. He could fight. He could try to escape and watch as the bayou's unchecked sickness finally consumed St. Leroux, driving every last resident into a permanent waking nightmare. Or he could accept. He could sacrifice his life, his identity, his very self, to become something other. He could pay the final toll, not with his death, but with his life, and in doing so, quote, truly save his sister's legacy in the town that had betrayed them both. He looked at the ancient, reptilian eyes surrounding him, and, for the first time, he did not see monsters. He saw a reflection of the choice before him, ancient, terrible, and absolute. For 6 months later, a U-Haul truck, looking impossibly bright and clean, rumbled down the Cypress Road. The Henderson family, fleeing city prices and seeking a quiet life, had bought the old Carter house for a song. The town of St. Leroux seemed peaceful, if a little sleepy. The listless apathy that had plagued the residents was gone, replaced by a slow, quiet purpose. People tended their gardens. They painted their porches. The sickness, it seemed, had passed, while her parents unloaded boxes. 6-year-old Maya Henderson, bored and curious, wandered away from the house. She was drawn toward the back of the property, toward the line of trees that separated the lawn. From the bayou, she followed the sound of the cicadas, a sound that was no longer oppressive, but simply a steady, rhythmic hum. She found herself at the edge of St. Augustine's Rest. The cemetery looked less menacing in the bright afternoon sun, more like a forgotten garden. The water of the bayou lapped gently at its edge, clear and shimmering. Maya knelt at the water's edge, captivated by a bright red dragonfly that danced on the surface. She reached out a small hand to touch it as her fingers neared the water. A long, dark shape materialized just beneath the surface. It was an alligator, larger than any she had ever seen in a zoo, its hide a tapestry of ancient scars and new green moss. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, placing itself between her hand and the dragonfly. Maya gasped and pulled her hand back. She wasn't scared, okay? She was fascinated. The alligator did not move. It simply floated there, a silent, patient guardian. Its eye, a slit of brilliant reptilian gold, opened and fixed on her. It was an eye that held no malice, no hunger. It held an ancient, weary intelligence, an understanding. The eye held her gaze for a long moment. Then, with a slow, almost imperceptible nod of its massive head, the alligator sank back into the depths, disappearing without a ripple, as if it had never been there at all. Maya's mother called her name from the house, and the little girl ran back, the strange encounter already starting to feel like a dream. She didn't see the man who watched her from the shadows of the cemetery. It was a tall man, dressed in the simple, weathered clothes of a groundskeeper. He leaned on a shovel, his face obscured by the brim of a straw hat. He watched the girl run back to the safety of her new home, and then he turned his gaze back to the water. His work, for now, was done. The balance was kept. Toll was paid.